Friends, would you pray with me? Oh God, take our lips and speak with them. Take our minds and think with them. Take our hands and work with them. And take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you and all of creation. Amen. What do you live for? What would you die for? What are you willing to give your life for? And to these questions, who is getting in the way? Who is holding you back? A 3,100-foot sheer granite cliff looms. One of the most magnificent outcrops of uninterrupted vertical rock cliff faces on Earth. Totok Anula from the Miwok language in California, or El Capitan as the first white settler occupiers who came into that beautiful Yosemite Valley first named it. This cliff certainly has been for thousands of years regarded by many as the chief, a monolith with commanding power and presence in the minds and hearts of humans, especially that small and unique segment of humanity known as rock climbers. Thank you, Stan Lee, the late Marvel comic creator who died this past week, who brought Spidey into our mind's eye. It is these human-like Spidey creatures who first recorded scaling this mammoth cliff back in 1958. With lots of ropes, bolts, fixed routes, food and water, it took Warren Harding's team 47 days to get those 3,100 feet from bottom to top. And in reflecting on what some have said as conquering this cliff, Warren said, "As I staggered over the rim, it was not at all clear to me who is the conqueror and who is the conquered. I do recall that El Cap seems to be in much better condition than I was." Since 1958, human climbers have kept returning to this iconic cliff, a temple of sorts, the focus and attention of tens of thousands who have come to this place to remember their place as small, insignificant. A place of reverence, a place of humility, a place of honesty, wild beauty, and a place of extremes. And on June 3rd of this past year, 2017, after just 3 hours and 56 minutes, a 32-year-old climber named Alex Honnold climbed El Capitan and made history. For Alex climbed this 3,100-foot expanse with no equipment other than rock climbing shoes and a small chalk bag on his waist. Free solo. He became the first known human to ascend this cliff without any ropes, without any safety equipment, without any backup plan. Now, there's a great film out right now in smaller cinemas called Free Solo that tells this story of this historic accomplishment. Has anyone seen it yet? Okay, I'll try not to give too many spoiler alerts, but the history is already known. But indeed, this is quite an unflinching film by Jimmy Chin and others, and I have not been able to get some of the incredible images up from it out of my mind these past 2 weeks. Images of Alex suspended thousands of feet above the ground, massive Douglas fir trees reduced to mere specks, clinging to what seemed like smooth rock faces with the tip of a toe, while his other toe dangles and his fingers reach high above his head in search of minuscule ridges and micro crevices to pull himself up by. Free Solo is an amazing film that depicts an amazing human feat. Now, some, however, would likely label Alex as a deranged daredevil, a reckless seeker, or a thrill seeker. But the film shows him to be far from such caricatures. In fact, he seems neither obsessed nor possessed with ego. He comes across as a focused, driven, curious, eclectic, and sometimes one who embodies the very pure essence of things, and especially a simple love of climbing. He describes free soloing as the purest way one can connect with a rock, with the out of doors, without the distractions and complexities of ropes and equipment, and a way to accomplish something of total excellence. Free soloing, of course, allows climbers no room for error, at least not without fatal consequences. I was struck that Alex comes across in this film as someone who, to use our spiritual language, feels deeply called to something. And he's putting his life on the line to do something he feels in the core essence of who he is called to do. Beyond its stunning and often vertigo-inducing cinematography, a fascinating part of this movie is that in the course of the 2 years or so of Alex's careful strategic planning and training to take on this first ever human ascent, he finds a love interest. However, this attraction soon becomes a distraction, for after having about 7 years record of not falling or slipping at all in his climbing, he fell after meeting his new love interest, not once but twice, injuring his back and his ankle, almost taking him out of the game. Also, up until this point in his climbing career, Alex had performed most of his free climbs solo, by himself, without the distractions of a 10-person film crew, many of whom are dangling off cliff faces with cameras in his face to capture this singular moment. The first attempt that Alex actually makes on this ascent, he has to stop as he felt too much distraction, too much attention. It seemed to him as if people were getting in the way, people getting in the way of his calling. Beware the scribes, today's gospel refrain goes. Although Jesus doesn't say this, he implies further, for they are getting in the way. Scribes, religious leaders who often spoke for God, are getting in the way of God. Beware such scribes. Let's remember some context. We're getting toward the end of Mark's 16 chapter gospel account of Jesus, and in today's story, we see Jesus inside the temple where he has been for the past several chapters teaching. But not just teaching, he's challenging. He's provoking, even. Our call to worship this morning, taken from Hebrews, reminds us of that wonderful line, may we continue to provoke one another on toward love and good deeds. Jesus has been doing this provocation throughout these final chapters of Mark, of course, leads him eventually to crucifixion at the hands of the state. The powerful do not like being provoked in love. Beware of the scribes. Jesus' provocation here is against fellow religious leaders like himself. Yet they couldn't have been further apart from the socio-economic level of Jesus. Jesus was a radical, roving rabbi with nothing. From that nothing can good come out of Nazareth's place, born poor to an unwed teenage mother. These scribes who serve as interpreters of Torah and Moses' law are people who served at the temple in Jerusalem. So they were well connected to the highly powerful. Their power came at the behest of Rome. They were likely pawns in the imperial oversight of religious life for the rest of their people. Jesus calls out these scribes for getting in the way of the realm of God, for misinterpreting what it means to be about the way of God for the people. He calls them out for hypocrisy. Beware of the scribes, those who wear long robes, who are greeted with respect in marketplaces, who have the best seats in the sanctuary and places of honor at banquets. Okay, for those of us this morning who are wearing long robes, or in the Greek, stole is actually more an accurate translation here, and who sit at the best seats in the sanctuary, had better listen up. Jesus is calling us out for sure. Are we walking the talk? Are we trapped in cycles of power unknowing? Are we somehow devouring widows' houses? I'm sorry you're not all off the hook yet. Even if you're not robe and stole wearing this morning and you find yourself sitting way in a far back pew, maybe even far away from one of the convenient lights to light up your bulletin, you too better pay attention. For none of us are off the hook. Jesus is calling to all of us. I'd suggest that a good spiritual practice when encountering stories in the gospel is to listen for wherever Jesus calls out certain groups of people or practices. And then place yourself in the very shoes of those being called out. For remaining comfortable and detached from such stories, while tempting, often leaves us missing the full impact of their import. On one level, then, might we all be scribes, prioritizing power over God, concerned with how we appear, how we come across, how long and excellent our prayers may sound, and forget the core essence of our heart. Are we observing how true things are in our world, or are we cruising along comfortably on the surface, scared to ask deep questions. As part of Jesus' calling out of the scribes here, he walks over to the treasury within the temple and sits down and observes. He observes what's going on. The story that then unfolds is one we know well called the widow's mite, taken from the Greek word that means 2 copper mites or lepta coins together, which are worth about 6 minutes of an average daily wage for common laborers. These are the coins that the widow puts in the treasury that day. Jesus here is woke to the social injustices of his day, to what is really happening. He sees this widow in bondage to poverty and patriarchal systems of religion and society that keep women who are unlinked to men as possessions rather than persons. We can almost hear Jesus saying, "We believe you, me too, time's up, widows' lives matter." The Hebrew and Greek here for the term widow comes from the root word helplessness, emptiness, or being forsaken. While most in the hustle and the bustle of a temple worship and commerce likely do not notice this widow, perhaps one among many, Jesus does. And Jesus sees those who feel forsaken, those who appear helpless and empty. Well, many have taken inspiration from this widow whose proportional giving shames the calculating rich, which of course has its merit. I do not see this primarily as a stewardship text, at least as it's often interpreted. Let's all give more like the widow and less like the rich. It should not be boiled down to a message of right giving that just happens to coincide with the end of our season of generosity. I don't think this is the way we're supposed to interpret this. I'm sorry, my dear and faithful generosity generators. It's actually a text that I believe is much deeper than that. A depth that it does indeed speak of generosity and self-giving, but one that does not uphold virtuous practices that do not uphold as virtuous practices that keep the poor poor, that keep them bound to poverty and bondage to supporting a church or a temple tax, or even a church stewardship campaign. Notice how Jesus does not say how great this widow is to his disciples. How excellent is it that she's giving so sacrificially, even to the point of death. Remember, she gives all that she has to live on. The text does not say what happens after she leaves the temple. But I think too often in trying to find an easy stewardship example here, we read into this text and instead make her the poster child of faithful giving. But Jesus is speaking, I think, a powerful critique. The rich give a lot, but also keep a lot. Out of their privilege and abundance, the widow gives out of her poverty. She gives all that she has. But continuing this, he critiques the scribes by saying and calling out a corrupt religious practice that permits and even encourages people to give such sacrificially in their life of worship. Shouldn't have some religious leaders, like the scribes, stopped her, perhaps, from giving those lepta, those mites, that day? Shouldn't they have called out how she might be someone they are called to serve, as is throughout our Torah message? I wonder, as we look closer into this story, of how we connect. Do we connect to the widow here? Do we connect with the scribes? Often I think we might connect with the widow, but in looking more carefully at this, we may realize that we might be indeed also far from that. Not too many of us give absolutely all that we have to the work of something greater than ourselves. We often calculate carefully and perhaps give our tax deductions at the end of our year. Our society, of course, doesn't help us. Remember, first we have Black Friday, then Small Business Saturday, then Cyber Monday, and then finally, eventually, we get to Giving Tuesday. You know, if we have anything left over. Giving often, for some, come last on the agenda. And of course, give all you have to live on would not actually be a very good popular season of generosity theme. Jesus observes the truth of the widow's life and calls us to such observation and such way of noticing the world and simplicity in our midst. He paid attention, and he calls us to do the same. Well, today marks indeed the end of our season of generosity. Later in our service, we will dedicate our pledges. And those cards indeed represent a prayerful and a deeply faithful response to God in the world and our call to follow God's way in our world. And of course, we as a community give such thanks to all those intentions that will be faithfully put in that plate today or beyond through emails. And our theme, of course, this year has not been give all that you have to live on, but all things. As we heard earlier in chapter 10 of Mark, all things are possible with God. Yes, all things are possible. Alex, even free soloing El Capitan. So friends, as we pay attention more, what is your El Capitan? What are you being called to free solo? What risky, challenging, inspiring, daunting thing calls to you from the core of who you are when you sit down and take time to listen? What are you willing to put your life on the line for? A specific mission? A love? A relationship? A call to specific social justice? For some of us, getting out of bed each day may be just as much of an extreme risk of free soloing that we can manage. For some of us, it may be our life's work, our collective dream, our passion, or as Desmond Tutu likes to put it, God's dream in us. It might be living ethically, living the Beatitudes, guerrilla gardening, serving and being served by those experiencing homelessness, teaching, mentoring, being a new grandparent, singing, swimming, composting or composing, visiting people in prison or detention, in nursing homes, in hospitals, creating art, living as Christ-like people in our world. These all may be examples of a free soloing call to go beyond the limits of what we think is possible. It may be a lifelong focus. It may also just be a 3 hours and 56-minute kind of thing. It may be choosing to speak up the truth during difficult conversations. Thanksgiving is coming up. Many of us may be around a table with friends and family that think differently than us. Are we feeling called to bring the difficult conversations of difference to the table, of anti-racism, of how we might be called as people of faith to live in our unsettling world? A week ago, on our day off, on Monday, Becky Bowen and I had the chance to go to Walden Pond. And in walking through those November golden brown oak-leafed trails around that pond, we of course contemplated Henry David Thoreau, whose writing about his 2-year, 2-month, and 2-day adventure into intentional living and simplicity continues to inspire the world and makes that otherwise perhaps unknown pond pretty famous. Thoreau most certainly put his neck on the line for others. His El Capitan was to speak out vehemently and ferociously against slavery. He was a committed abolitionist, and he spoke out over and over again against war and the war economy. Sometimes we forget when we think about just Walden Pond and his incredible love of intentional living, directed by and guided by listening closely to the earth, that Thoreau was a ferocious advocate for justice, and he put his life on the line. He literally did. When John Brown was convicted, he spoke publicly as everyone else, even abolitionists, remained quiet. Thoreau spoke up many occasions here in Massachusetts in support of John Brown, even harboring some of those convicted felons from Harper's Ferry here and shuttling them to freedom, as he had done with many others as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Thoreau put his life on the line, and as our climate activist journalist friend Wen Stevenson has written recently about this, he believes that Thoreau's solidarity and profoundly moral, even spiritual awakening in nature led him back into society to be in radical political engagement on behalf of others, his neighbors, his fellow citizens in Concord, or fugitives who took refuge in Walden's Wood. Because of Henry Thoreau, to live in harmony with nature is to act in solidarity with our fellow human beings, Wen wrote. Indeed, we could use a lot more Thoreau-like inspired solidarity in these days. In these days when the term campfire no longer conjures images of s'mores around us, but horrific images of paradise lost. What's been happening in California this past week and a half is utterly tragic. We have a lot more widows in our world, literal and figurative, those without, those who have lost everything to live on, to lost and of course lost loved ones. We think of Mother Earth, we think of Mother Widow Earth in the light of this? These fires, which of course come because of climate change, the Merrimack Valley gas explosions, also climate injustice here in our own neighborhood, not nearly as tragic, but also such a disruption for our own Commonwealth, where some 7,000 people still live in shelters over this Thanksgiving holiday. And of course, the caravan that has now arrived at the border with US and Mexico. That caravan is a caravan of climate refugees. We know that from our sisters and brothers in Dulce Nombre de Jesus, where people are leaving Nicaragua and Honduras and other places because farms are drying up because of climate change, which is adding again to turmoil and political unrest. On top of that, causes people to seek asylum, to seek sanctuary. And our response as a country is to put more guns along that border in the hands of unpaid or underpaid young military people trying to serve their country. So friends, in the light of this climatic injustice, in the light of an uncertain world, what are we living for and what are we willing to die for? What are we willing to take risks for? And the next question comes, who is preventing us from doing such things? Are there film crews hovering too close to you, distracting you, causing you to move, to lose your footing, to forget your place in the world? Are you filling and are you feeling filled to live out your calling in these days? Friends, the example of our Free Solo movie gives us an idea of a way to move forward. In this film, we hear that Alex is perhaps distracted by those around him, but in the end, it's very clear that there's no way that he could have climbed and free soloed this incredible feat without a radical community of support, from his new partner to his filming crew, who were so encouraging along the way throughout the months and years of his training, and one specific friend, Tommy Caldwell, another famous climber who trained with him around the world for 2 years to make this happen. And then in return, Alex is not a self-focused person. He started a foundation which brings solar panels and solar electricity around our world. He gives a lot of his earnings to the work of sustainability in addressing the needs of our mother widow Earth. So friends, may we look and spend time considering what we might be called to free solo, remembering as we do so we're never alone, but we are each called alone at times to walk that lonesome valley, knowing that God goes with us and is present with us. So to conclude, I want to, in the spirit of Pete Seeger, lead us in singing Jesus Walked This Lonesome Valley. It is on page 80 in your hymnal. If you want to follow along, it's pretty simple. Jesus walked this lonesome valley. He had to walk it by himself, and then we must walk this lonesome valley. We have to walk it by ourselves. Jesus walked this lonesome valley. He had to walk it by himself. Oh, nobody else could walk it for him. He had to walk it by himself. We must walk this lonesome valley. We had to walk it by ourselves. Oh, nobody else can walk it for us. We have to walk it by ourselves. God goes with us. Amen.